The city of York, capital of the north and a royalist stronghold, was under siege by the allied armies of the English and Scottish Parliaments. King Charles was well aware of the consequences of losing the city. "If York be lost, I shall esteem my crown little less," and he ordered his nephew, Prince Rupert, "March with all your forces to the relief of York." Rupert, who had just captured Liverpool, advanced across the Pennines from Lancashire and took the Allied forces by surprise, causing them to break off the siege and retreat.
The King and the cause! The King and the cause! The Church and the laws! The Church and the laws!
The Royalist army forced the Allies to turn and fight, taking position on a moor set about by ditches some 6 miles from York. The Allied armies gathered on a ridge overlooking the moor, many of their soldiers singing psalms and calling upon God to help them that day. And so the stage was set for what was to be one of the biggest battles ever fought on English soil, and one that was to shape the future of England, Scotland and Ireland. The date, July the 2nd, 1644. The place, Marston Moor. At around 2 in the afternoon, the first shots were fired by Royalist cannon, soon countered by those of the Allies. Both armies had the majority of their infantry in the centre and their cavalry on the wings. Rupert was outnumbered. He had no more than 20,000 men, opposing him more than 25,000. The forces stretched for almost a mile and a half between the villages of Tockwith and Long Marston, but were separated only by some 500 yards. The artillery continued for several hours, but in the early evening, it stopped. We had a general silence on both sides, each expecting who should begin the charge. In this posture we stood till 7 of the clock, so that it was concluded that there would be no engagement that night. Prince Rupert sent to York for food. The Allied forces gave themselves over again to the singing of psalms. But then, as one of the Allied soldiers later wrote, "About half an hour after 7 o'clock that evening, we, seeing the enemy would not charge us, resolved by the help of God to charge them. And so the sign being given, God with us, we marched down to them." On the Allied left, Fraser's Scots dragoons were first to engage. Their task to clear the ditch of Napier's troops and allow the cavalry to attack. Dragoons were mounted infantry, dismounting to fire. Fraser's were armed with matchlock muskets, slow to reload, taking some 30 seconds. So, after only a few shots, they charged, many using the butts of their muskets as clubs. In their wake came the left wing of the Allied cavalry, under the command of Oliver Cromwell. As well as a sword, most of the cavalry carried pistols. Facing them, the Royalist cavalry commanded by Lord John Byron. Byron had interspersed his cavalry with musketeers to give supporting fire, but he led his cavalry forward, preventing the muskets from firing at the enemy. As one on the field that day noted, the horse on both sides behaved themselves with the utmost bravery, for having discharged their pistols, they fell to it with the sword. Cromwell's troopers gradually gained the upper hand, and the Royalist cavalry fell back in confusion. At this crucial moment, Prince Rupert himself joined the fray. In this engagement, Cromwell was wounded, and the Allied position came under threat, eventually to be relieved by a charge from Scottish veteran David Leslie, whose cavalry included many lancers. Some of the cavalry on both sides wore iron helmets and upper body armor, but many wore only a buff leather coat. While this could stop a sword cut, it could not stop a well-aimed thrust from sword or lance. Meanwhile, to the right of Cromwell, the Allied infantry advanced. The Earl of Manchester's musketeers showed that even the slow and cumbersome matchlock musket was formidable in well-trained hands. Advancing 6 deep, firing and reloading as they came, they drove back the Royalist infantry. After each rank had fired, it turned away to reload, the next moving forward to take its place. The rear ranks loaded with powder, shot and wadding, ramming home before advancing again. An eyewitness account tells us the main bodies joining made such a noise with shot and clamour of shouts that we lost our ears, and the smoke of powder was so thick that we saw no light but what proceeded from the mouth of the guns. To Manchester's right, the advance of the Allied infantry, commanded by Lord Fairfax, was also proving unstoppable. Swept over the ditch, driving back the Royalist front line opposing them and capturing cannon. To the right of Lord Fairfax's infantry, the Scots regiments moved forward to the ditch. Both they and the Royalist infantry opposing them were experienced and well-trained. Ash pikes, 16 feet long, tipped with steel heads, were formidable weapons in the hands of well-drilled infantry. And so, at the ditch, the Scots were held at push of pike by the opposing Royalist infantry. The cavalry on the right wing of the Allied army was commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, who led the advance at the head of 400 horse. We were a long time engaged, but at last we routed that part of their wing. We pursued them a good way towards York. It was a costly victory, but the rest of Fairfax's wing was even less fortunate. Moving ahead of their supporting infantry, some cavalry had to advance down a lane to the moor where, as Fairfax later reported, for betwixt us and the enemy was no passage but at a narrow lane, where they could not march above 3 or 4 in front. Upon one side of the lane was a ditch, and on the other an hedge. Both were lined with musketeers. The advancing cavalry was raked by fire from them. And those who passed the fire were attacked in turn by squadrons of Goring's cavalry. In their retreat, they scattered some of their own infantry. Meanwhile, the Scots infantry continued their struggle against the Royalist centre, even when some were forced to turn to counter-attacks on the flank by Royalist cavalry, which they resisted with great valour. In the centre, however, the tide was turning against the Allied armies. Lord Fairfax, father of Sir Thomas, was forced to give way against a furious counter-attack from cavalry and the infantry of Newcastle's Whitecoats, which drove him back over the ditch, sweeping away the Allied reserve. It appeared as if the parliamentary cause was lost. But then, to the aid of the shattered centre, came Manchester's victorious infantry and Cromwell's and Leslie's cavalry from the left. Having routed the Prince's right wing, Leslie and Cromwell wisely restrained the great bodies of their horse from pursuing these broken troops. Together, Manchester, Leslie and Cromwell fell upon the exposed flank of the Royalist infantry, dispersing the enemy's foot almost as fast as they charged, cutting them down, that we carried the whole field before us, thinking nothing to be done but to kill and take prisoners. Our horse and foot came in a very good order to a second charge, with all the enemy's horse and foot that had disordered our right wing and main battle. We went on with great resolution, charging them so home with such valour we made them fly before us. Meanwhile, a desperate struggle had developed around the Royalists' one remaining coherent fighting force, Newcastle's regiment of Whitecoats. Here the Parliament horse received their greatest loss, and a stop for some time to their hoped-for victory. This sole regiment, after the day was lost, would take no quarter, and by mere valour for 1 whole hour kept the troops of horse from entering amongst them at near push of pike, until at length the Scots regiment of dragoons was brought to open them upon some hand, which at length they did. fire of these dragoons took its toll on the Whitecoats. At last gaps appeared in their ranks into which the cavalry charged, and so it was, when the horse did enter they would have no quarter. They fought it out till was not 30 of them living, and those whose hap it was to be beaten down upon the ground, as the troopers came near them, though they could not rise for their wounds, yet were so desperate as to get either a pike or sword, and to gore the troopers' horses as they came over them or passed them by. When all their ammunition was spent, having refused quarters, every man fell in the same order and rank wherein he had fought. The battle was over by 9 o'clock. As for the number of slain, upon our first view they seemed to be 4,000, of which I believe nigh 3 parts were theirs. As for the enemy, the truth is, they behaved themselves with more valour and resolution that ever man saw coincident with so bad a cause. Just as King Charles had feared, the loss of the battle lost him the north. In time, he would lose the war, his throne, and his life.